They sent her away in the week of her father's funeral. Not after. Not when the grief had settled and the decisions had been made properly. In the week of the funeral, while the incense from the service was still in the curtains, while the condolence cards were still stacked on the hall table, that's who we're talking about today. Her name is Abena. She came into the Asante family at 6 years old, brought in by a man named Kofi Asante, who genuinely meant well, raised in a house that had already decided what she was allowed to be. And when Kofi died, the house showed her exactly what it thought she was worth. 60 Ghana cedis and a canvas bag. That was it. 12 years in that house, and they handed her the door with 60 cedis in her pocket. But here's the thing about Abena. She didn't break. She didn't disappear. She took that 60 cedis and that canvas bag, and she built something quietly, methodically, over 10 years that none of them saw coming. 10 years later, she came back, and this time, she owned the gate. Let's go back to the beginning, because to understand what happens at the end, you need to understand what Abena was walking into when she was 6 years old. The Asante compound was beautiful. I want to be clear about that. Tiled floors, a garden, a sitting room kept for visitors, a house that knew who it belonged to. And Kofi Asante, the man who brought Abena in, he was genuinely a good man. His younger cousin had lost her husband, couldn't support her daughter, and Kofi said, "Bring the child here. She'll go to school with Akua. She'll be raised as one of our own." He meant every word of that. The problem was Madame Efua. Now, Madame Efua never said anything cruel. That's what made it so precise. She was the kind of woman who delivers a verdict in the tone of a weather report. She didn't tell Abena she wasn't welcome, she just made it felt. The smaller room at the back of the house. The school trip permission form that got forgotten, then forgotten again. The family photographs where Abena always appeared at the edge, slightly cut off, like the person holding the camera wasn't quite sure if she should be in the frame. And Akua, who was 2 years younger, and growing up watching all of this, she learned from her mother, not openly cruel, just comfortable with the distance. She'd borrow Abena's things without asking, return them damaged, mention Abena's minor mistakes to Madame Efua with the helpful accuracy of someone who knows exactly what they're doing. Abena navigated all of it, because what choice did she have? But here's what kept her together through 12 years of that house. Kofi. Kofi reviewed her homework. Kofi attended her prize ceremonies when Madame Efua had a scheduling conflict again. Kofi kept every school certificate Abena ever earned in a folder in his study. And once, when they were sitting in the garden in the evening, he told her she reminded him of his own mother, a woman who had worked 3 jobs and never once acted like it was anything special. Abena held on to that sentence for the next 14 years. Now, there's a moment I want you to sit with before we move on. Abena is around 14 in this moment. She and Kofi are in the garden in the evening. He came home early from work that day, which was unusual, and they're not talking about anything in particular. And he turns to her and says she reminds him of his mother. A woman who worked 3 jobs and never once suggested it was extraordinary. That's it. That's the whole thing. He didn't give a speech, didn't sit her down and tell her she was loved. He just said it, quietly, in a garden, not even looking at her directly. Abena held that sentence for the next 14 years. Think about what that tells you, about how starved she was for that kind of recognition in that house. That one offhand sentence from a man in a garden became the thing she carried through everything that came next. Meanwhile, Abena was doing what she had always done, excelling. Quietly, systematically, with the focus of someone who has identified the one thing nobody in that house can take from her: her grades, her certificates, her ability. By the time she was 18, she was the top student in her secondary school cohort. She had a folder of certificates her father kept for her in his study. She had 12 years of experience navigating a house that had been designed, from the beginning, to minimize her, and she had come through it not minimized, but sharpened. And then, on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, Kofi Asante had a cardiac episode at his office. There is no good way to say this. He was there in the morning reviewing something at his desk, and by the afternoon he was gone. A cardiac event. The kind of death that gives nobody time to prepare and leaves everything it finds in exactly the state it finds it. Abena was in the middle of her final secondary school examinations when the call came. She sat the remaining papers. Not because she didn't grieve, she did deeply. In the private way she did everything, but because she understood, in the first hours after that phone call, that grief was the thing she could not afford to let take up all the available space. Something was coming. She could feel its shape before she could see it. She was right, and what was coming had been arranged before Kofi's body was in the ground. But before we get there, I want you to hold on to one thing. One sentence that a man said in a garden to a 14-year-old girl who had spent 8 years being told, through 1,000 small, precise actions, that she was peripheral. He said she reminded him of his mother, a woman who worked 3 jobs and never made it into a big deal. That sentence, Abena carried it for 14 years. And in the darkest parts of what comes next, that sentence was the thing that kept the list going. And by the time the hospital called, he was already gone. And with him went the only person in that house who had ever looked at Abena and seen exactly what she was. Now here's where the story gets darker. And I need you to pay attention to this part, because this is where you really understand what kind of people we're dealing with. Kofi had made a will. Of course he had. He was a careful man. He had a lawyer, Mr. Kwabena Darko, 11 years working together, and he had documented everything. The compound goes to Madam Efua. Akua gets a trust fund. And Abena, named specifically, by full name, as his ward and adopted daughter, gets an equal trust fund, plus a rental property in Kumasi that Kofi had inherited from his own father and maintained for 20 years. He had even told Darko, when they were finalizing the paperwork, make sure it holds. Whatever happens, make sure it holds. Darko tried to schedule the reading. Madame Efua was unavailable. Then she was available, but Darko had a conflict. Then she was available again, but needed to reschedule. And Darko, who had been doing this for 30 years and knew exactly what was happening, made a decision. He took every document, made copies, put them in a separate location from his main files. He wrote Abena's name on a sealed envelope, placed it in his personal safe, attached a note that said, "When she is ready." He would keep it there for 10 years. 10 years. Let me say that again. This man, Kofi's lawyer, sat on this envelope for 10 years, paying rent on a safe deposit to hold documents that belonged to a girl he had never personally met, because a client he respected had said, make sure it holds. And he had decided to take that seriously. That's the kind of integrity that doesn't get talked about enough. Darko didn't have to do any of that. The estate proceedings had gone cold. Nobody was asking questions. He could have filed it away and moved on. Instead, he kept it current, kept it ready, kept writing Abena's name in his mental file every year that passed. Some people in this story failed Abena. Darko wasn't one of them. And here's what I want you to understand about what Darko did. He had no obligation to hold that envelope. The estate proceedings had gone cold. Nobody was following up. He could have filed it and moved on with his practice and told himself he had done his part. Instead, he sat with it, made copies, kept the originals separate, renewed the safe deposit every year, wrote her name in his mental file every 12 months that passed. That is what integrity looks like when nobody is watching. Meanwhile, 3 weeks after the funeral, Abena was in the kitchen washing the breakfast dishes when Madame Efua came to the doorway. She said the arrangement was no longer sustainable. That's the word she chose. Arrangement. Abena turned off the tap. She didn't argue, didn't cry, didn't ask why or beg or appeal to 12 years of living in that house. She set the dish down on the rack, dried her hands, and walked to her room. 20 minutes later, she came out with a canvas bag, 3 changes of clothes, the certificate folder she had already taken from Kofi's study the night after the funeral because she already knew the study was going to get cleaned out, a small photograph of herself and Kofi from her primary school graduation, and 60 Ghana cedis. Akua was standing at the top of the stairs when Abena came through the hallway, watching, Not hiding, not pretending not to look, just watching with the stillness of someone who is satisfied with how this is going. Abena looked at her for exactly 2 seconds. Then she opened the front door and walked out. I want to stop here for a second, because think about what that took. No tears, no confrontation, no how could you after 12 years. Nothing. She just walked. And that's 12 years of training right there, 12 years of learning which battles in that house cost more than they gave back. She left cleanly because making a scene would have given them the satisfaction of a reaction. And she was not going to give them that. Not 1 second of it. The bougainvillea at the gate was still flowering orange as she walked through. The same flowers that had been flowering since the day she arrived, 6 years old, with her mother and 2 suitcases. They didn't know the difference between that day and this one. They were just flowers doing what flowers do. Abena adjusted the strap of the canvas bag, started walking, and on the bus, with 60 cedis in her pocket and the certificate folder on her lap, she opened her mind the way other people open a notebook to the first clean page, and she started the list. 3 things she knew how to do. That was enough. That was always enough to begin. The gate clicked shut. Not a slam, a click, the small, clean sound of a door that has already made its decision. And Abena adjusted the bag on her shoulder, and she started walking toward the bus station, and she made a list in her head of everything she knew how to do. So here's Abena, 18 years old, bus ride across the city, canvas bag on her lap, 60 cedis in her pocket, and she is making a list. She could teach. She had been tutoring students for 3 years. She could organize. She had managed the Asante household accounts twice when Madame Efua was traveling, and she had quietly noticed that 2 suppliers had been overcharging by 15% for over a year. She never told Madame Efua. She had understood even then that being right about something in that house was not the same as being thanked for it. The bus stopped at the street nearest her old secondary school teacher's house, Mrs. Owusu, a woman who had once told Abena, "If you ever need a reference letter, you come to me." Abena knocked on the door with a canvas bag and 60 cedis, and no plan beyond that moment. Mrs. Owusu opened the door, looked at Abena, looked at the bag, stepped back and said, "Come in, I'll make tea." She stayed 4 months. She paid her way from day one washing clothes for neighbours, tutoring primary school children in Mrs. Owusu's sitting room, helping the provisions store down the road with evening inventory. She saved every cedi that didn't have somewhere necessary to go. Now the thing about Abena is that she doesn't let you see her break. She never has. But she did break, just once, in the privacy of Mrs. Owusu's spare room. She cried exactly once. About 3 weeks in, late on a Tuesday night, when the discipline she had been running on finally ran out and the grief caught up for Kofi, for the certificate folder she'd had to take like a thief from her own father's study, for 6-year-old Abena arriving in that house in a car with 2 suitcases and not yet knowing what kind of welcome was being extended. She cried, and then she stopped, and she opened her notebook to the next clean page and worked out the math of what the Polytechnic program would cost and how many months she needed to get there. 4 months. She enrolled on a Thursday and started the following Monday. Found a morning job at a printing business. Moved to a rented room so small that the window was also the ventilation. Read her coursework at night by a second-hand lamp she had bought and fixed herself. And then, year by year, quietly, without anyone in the Asante compound having any idea, she built. Year 3. Accounts assistant at a trading company in Accra. Promoted twice. Year 5. Moved to a property management firm. A man named Mr. Acheampong gave her more responsibility than her title warranted because he could see what she was actually capable of. Year 7. 2 investment properties of her own, generating income. Year 10. 4 properties. Her own client base. A reputation in Accra's property circles built entirely from work. 10 years. From 60 cedis and a list on a bus. Let that sit for a second, because I need you to understand what that actually means. This is not a montage. This is not a movie where we skip to the part where she's successful and everything is fine. This is a woman who tutored children in a borrowed sitting room and washed neighbours' clothes and fixed a second-hand lamp and read her coursework by its light in a room so small the window was also the ventilation. She didn't have a safety net. She didn't have family money she could fall back on. She didn't have the Asante name or the Asante connections or the Asante compound to give her credibility when she walked into rooms. She had the list. She had the work. She had the particular determination of someone who has been told through 12 years of small, precise actions that she wasn't enough, and who had quietly, privately, decided not to believe it. And every year, she got closer to being able to prove it. Year 3, accounts assistant, promoted twice. Year 5, property management firm, an older man named Achimpong who could see what she was actually capable of and gave her responsibility to match it. Year 7, her first 2 investment properties. Year 10, 4 properties. Her own company. A reputation built entirely from work. Not from connections, not from a family name, from work. While she was doing all of this, while she was building, year by year, from 60 cedis the Asante compound was being mortgaged. The woman who had told Abena there was no longer a suitable place for her had been making financial decisions that were slowly pulling the foundation out from under the house. Nobody in that compound knew that the solution to their problem was the person they had sent away. That's the thing about this story. The irony is not accidental. It's structural. It was always going to end here. The woman who sent Abena away with 60 cedis was spending the compound's equity on business investments that would fail. And the girl she sent away was quietly, methodically building the exact professional skill set that the compound would one day need to survive. Neither of them knew it, but the story knew it. The story was already arranging the pieces. The email from Mr. Darko arrived on a Tuesday morning while Abena was reviewing a lease renewal. She read it, put her phone face down on the desk, sat very still for a moment. The name Kofi Asante, landing in her inbox after 10 years of silence, was like a stone dropped into water that had been still for a long time. She read it again. Then she replied. The following week, she walked into Darko's office. He stood when she came in, shook her hand. He was a small man with close-cropped greying hair and the particular stillness of someone who has been keeping something important for a long time and has thought carefully about how to give it back. He placed the sealed envelope on the table between them before he said a word. I should tell you what's inside, he said, before you open it. I think you're entitled to know it clearly before you decide what to do. He told her everything. The will, the Kumasi property, the trust amount, the 10 years he had spent preserving the documentation while Madame Afua's scheduling conflicts dragged on and on. He told her the will had never been superseded, that his copies were complete, that he had kept them in a separate location specifically because he had understood in the first 2 weeks after the funeral what was being arranged. And then he told her the other thing. The Asante compound, the compound Abena had walked out of with 60 cedis, had been mortgaged against a series of business investments over the past 3 years. The investments had failed. The mortgage was in serious arrears. The bank had issued formal notice. If no resolution was reached in 60 days, the property was going to forced sale. Abena looked at the number Darko gave her. She sat with it for a long moment. Give me 2 weeks, she said. That night, alone at her desk, she opened the envelope. Inside the legal documents was a letter 2 pages, in Kofi's handwriting. Not typescript, his actual hand. The same slightly tilted script she remembered from the notes he left on her homework. Good work. Think about this again. I'm proud of you. He wrote that he knew what had been happening in his house, that he had known for years, that he had not been brave enough to confront it directly, and that the will was his attempt to do in documentation what he had failed to do in life. He wrote, I was a man who loved you and did not fight for you the way you deserved. I am sorry it is this instead of better. I hope it is enough. And then, near the end, this. You will know what to do with it. You have always known what to do with things. That is one of the things I have always admired about you. She folded the letter, put it in the drawer where she kept the things most worth protecting, opened her laptop, and she began to calculate. But before she did, before the laptop opened and the spreadsheets started and the professional Abena took over, she sat at her desk in the quiet of her apartment and she let herself feel it, not the legal situation, not the opportunity. The letter, 2 pages in her father's handwriting, telling her things he had not been able to say in life. He wrote that he was sorry. Not in the abstract specifically. He named the things he had seen and not addressed. The room at the back, the photographs, the 12 years of small, precise exclusions. He had seen them. He had not been brave enough. He wrote, "I was a man who loved you and did not fight for you the way you deserved. And then, near the end, you will know what to do with it. You have always known what to do with things. That is one of the things I have always admired about you." She had waited 22 years to hear something like that. In the end, she heard it from a letter in a safe that a lawyer had kept for 10 years. She folded it, put it in the drawer where she kept the most important things, took a breath. Then she opened the laptop, pulled up her financial models, and began to calculate exactly how to turn her father's last gift into something he would have been proud of. 2 weeks. That's what she had asked Darko for. And in those 2 weeks, she ran every scenario, the Kumasi property value, the accrued rental income she had never received, the trust amount with interest, the compound's current valuation against the outstanding mortgage. She calculated what it would cost to buy the distressed debt from the bank. She calculated what fair market rent would be for Madame Efua and Akua as tenants. She calculated what the compound would generate over 10 years under proper management. And then she calculated the most important thing, whether she wanted to do this at all, whether extending this offer to the people who had sent her away with 60 cedis was something she was willing to do with her own resources and her own professional reputation. She gave herself 2 weeks to decide. She decided on day 11. The answer was yes, not from forgiveness, not from sentiment, but from the understanding that Kofi had lived in that compound. And some forms of dignity are expressed not in what you demand, but in what you choose to extend. Meanwhile, back at the Asante compound, things had not been going well. The business ventures Madame Efua had invested the compound equity into had not performed. That's the polite way to say it. The less polite way is that she had trusted a cousin's judgment, the cousin had been wrong, and the compound that Kofi had maintained for decades was now sitting under a mortgage that hadn't been properly serviced in over a year. The bank's letters had been arriving, growing more formal with each one, until the most recent used language that left no room for interpretation. Madame Efua had told Akua, temporary difficulty, being addressed. Nothing to worry about for now. Akua had accepted this the way she accepted most things in that house, with the easy confidence of someone who has never had to distrust an assurance. The bank's most recent letter had used a phrase, formal notice of intent, to proceed with forced sale that her previous lawyer had told her was standard language for pressure tactics. He had been wrong. It was not standard language. It was the last letter before action. Then Mr. Darko's letter arrived. Madame Efua read it at the kitchen table, the same table where she had stood 10 years ago and told Abena the arrangement was no longer sustainable. She sat at that table with her reading glasses on and the letter in her hands, and she read it 3 times. Then she called Akua down. Akua came in her silk robe, phone in hand, already wearing the expression of someone being inconvenienced by other people's emergencies. She read the letter over her mother's shoulder. She put her phone down on the table. Now I need you to understand that in 26 years, Akua putting her phone down voluntarily was not a common occurrence. The phone going down meant this situation had reached a weight that no screen could manage. "She's really coming back," Akua said. "She has made an appointment," Madame Efua said. "Thursday." The kitchen was quiet, and here's what I want you to notice about this moment. Madame Efua, the woman who had delivered Abena's expulsion with the calm efficiency of a household decision, was sitting in that same kitchen, in that same chair, with the letter of a woman she had sent away with 60 cedis. And for the first time in 30 years of running that household with absolute authority, she did not know how to manage what was coming. The clock was running. Thursday was 4 days away. And here's what I find remarkable about this moment. Madame Efua, a woman who has spent her entire adult life managing every situation that comes her way, is sitting at the kitchen table, and she cannot manage this one. Because this one comes with documentation. This one comes with a lawyer who kept an envelope for 10 years and a woman who spent 10 years building the capacity to open it. You cannot manage documentation with a scheduling conflict. You cannot avoid a will with a phone call. You cannot tell a property certificate that the arrangement is no longer sustainable. The tools that had always worked for Madame Efua, the precision, the efficiency, the management of appearances, none of them applied here, because Abena hadn't come back with hurt feelings. She had come back with paperwork, and Akua, sitting at that table with her phone face down for the first time in recent memory, was beginning to understand something for the first time. That the girl she had watched leave from the top of the stairs, the girl she had dismissed without a word, had not disappeared. She had become someone, and that someone had an appointment for Thursday, and Abena was already in the car. And I want to say something about the parallel here, because this is what makes this story so interesting to me. 10 years ago, Abena sat on a bus with 60 cedis, and she made a list of 3 things she could do. She had nothing else. And she worked from that list patiently, methodically, without anyone watching, until the list became a company, and the company became a portfolio, and the portfolio became the solution to a problem that the Asante family didn't know she was going to solve. Meanwhile, Madame Efua, who had every resource Abena didn't have, the compound, the connections, the family name, the social standing, had made decisions that brought her to this moment, sitting at the kitchen table, waiting for Thursday. The contrast is not dramatic. It's just mathematics. What you do with what you have, over time, determines what you have later. Abena did the math. Madame Efua didn't. And now Thursday was coming, 4 days, and somewhere across the city, in an apartment with a leather briefcase already packed on the table, Abena was sleeping, calmly, completely. The sleep of someone who has done the work and knows it. Madame Efua had 4 days to prepare for a meeting she could not prepare for, with a woman she had not thought about in 10 years, who was arriving with the one thing that no amount of efficiency or social management can neutralize: correct legal documentation and the professional standing to act on it. 4 days. And somewhere across the city, in an apartment with a leather briefcase already packed on the table, Abena was sleeping, calmly, completely. The sleep of someone who has done the work and knows it. The morning of the appointment, Abena woke at 5. She showered, made tea, stood at her apartment window and watched Accra coming awake in that early hour, the food sellers setting up, the cleaning trucks moving through empty streets, the light that belongs only to that time of morning. She thought about Kofi. Not with grief, exactly. Grief had settled into something quieter over 10 years. She thought about the letter, about the line that said, "You have always known what to do with things." She thought about the evening in the garden when he told her. She reminded him of his mother. She carried him into the morning with her, not as a wound, as a fact. She dressed. The Ankara blouse, deep blue and burnt orange, structured shoulders was the one she saved for important days. Dark pressed trousers. The leather briefcase that had been the first expensive thing she ever bought herself 3 years into the property business, as a deliberate statement about who she intended to be. She put the documents in the briefcase. The legal papers, the trust records, the estate correspondence, Darko's copies, everything. She placed Kofi's letter on top, closed the briefcase. Then she went downstairs and got in the car. The compound looked exactly as she remembered it. The bougainvillea at the gate still orange. The iron scrollwork unchanged. She pushed the gate open, same click as always, same gate she had walked through every day for 12 years, and went inside. Mr. Darko was already in the sitting room. He stood when she entered and gave her a brief nod, the nod of a man who has been waiting 10 years for a meeting and is satisfied to see it finally begin. Madame Efua was in her chair, Full presentation. The deep purple Kaaba, the heavy gold jewelry, the reading glasses on their beaded chain, everything immaculate. Because that's who she was even now, even here, the armor was on. Akua sat beside her in the second chair, watching. Abena sat down. And here is what I want you to picture. This sitting room, the one where every formal occasion in the Asante household happened for 12 years. The room Abena had entered hundreds of times, always slightly off-center, always at the edge of the frame. She is sitting in the center of it now, briefcase on the table, hands still. The room that once belonged to Madame Afua's version of this family is about to belong to a different version entirely. She opened the briefcase. She placed the documents on the table in a neat stack. And she looked at Madame Afua. "I'm here to settle what my father arranged for me," she said. "My father. Not my guardian. Not Mr. Asante. My father. Simple. No drama. Just the accurate word, the word Kofi himself had used in the documents, landing in the room like it was always supposed to be there." Madame Afua heard it. Something moved across her face very briefly before the composure closed over it. She picked up the first document and began to read. And here's the thing, the sitting room where this is happening, it's the same room where Abena spent 12 years slightly off-center, always at the edge, never quite in the frame. She's sitting in the center of it now, hands still, briefcase at her feet, watching the woman who sent her away with 60 cedis work through the paperwork that proves she should never have been sent away at all. Madame Afua set down the last page, removed her reading glasses, looked at Abena across the table. "What is the second matter?" she said. Her voice was level. It cost her something to keep it level. Abena recognized the cost. She had paid it herself, in this house, many times. "The compound," Abena said. "I'd like to make a proposal." And notice what she doesn't do here. She doesn't say, "the compound that should always have been protected by the will that you buried." She doesn't say the compound that Kofi built and that you nearly destroyed. She doesn't list the grievances. She doesn't make Madame Afua say the word sorry before they proceed. She just says, "I'd like to make a proposal." Because Abena understands something that the best people always understand, that what you need and what you need to perform are two different things. She needs the estate settled. She needs the property transferred. She doesn't need Madame Afua's remorse. And she's not going to waste the room's energy on something she doesn't need. That restraint right there, that's the most powerful thing in this scene. More powerful than any speech she could have given. Because Madame Afua was braced for a confrontation. Her lawyer had told her, without quite saying so, to be prepared for Abena to make this personal, to name things, to list grievances, to demand acknowledgement, and Abena gave her nothing to push back against. Nothing to defend, just a proposal, clean, professional, documented. The exact same register Madame Afua had always used to manage her household turned around and aimed at her across the same table where she had wielded it for 30 years. The room was quiet, and Madame Afua picked up the first page. The settlement took 3 weeks. Darko moved through each item, the Kumasi property transferred to Abena's name, the trust amount with 10 years of accrued interest, the formal estate acknowledgement signed and witnessed. Madame Afua's lawyer negotiated at the margins. Because that's what lawyers do when the documentation is complete and there is no legitimate alternative argument. They negotiate margins and hope the margins add up. They didn't. Abena's proposal for the compound was this. She would purchase the outstanding mortgage debt from the bank and take formal ownership of the property. Madame Afua and Akua could remain as tenants at fair market rent, processed through Abena's management company. No drama, no list of conditions, no requirement to say the word sorry, which Abena had stopped needing to hear a long time ago. Madame Afua signed on the 5th day, and I want you to notice something about that. The same efficiency she used to tell Abena to leave that same tone, that same practical register she used to sign the documents that made Abena the owner of the house. No acknowledgement, no reckoning, just the signature, and thank you for your time. That's who she was, from beginning to end. Some people are entirely consistent. The last day of the process was a Thursday, papers being executed in the sitting room. Abena was waiting in the hallway when Akua found her. She came carrying 2 cups of tea. They stood in the hallway, the same hallway Abena had walked through every day for 12 years, on her way to the kitchen, the garden, the front door, and for a moment neither of them said anything. Then Akua said, "I didn't know about the will. I was 16. I want you to know I didn't know what she did." Abena looked at her. "I believe you," she said. And she did. Because it was probably true, and because she had long since stopped needing the story to be simpler than it was. "I watched you leave," Akua said, "from the stairs. I've thought about that. I didn't do anything." "No," Abena said. "You didn't. Not cruel. Not forgiving exactly either. Just honest. The honest accounting of what happened." Then Akua said, "I didn't think you'd come back." And Abena looked at her, this woman she had grown up alongside, who had watched her leave from the top of the stairs without saying a word, and she said, "I didn't come back, Akua. I arrived. There's a difference." "What's the difference?" "Coming back means you left something unfinished. Arriving means you built something and brought it with you." She finished her tea, went back into the sitting room, shook Darko's hand. The papers were signed. The compound that had expelled her at 18 with a canvas bag and 60 cedis now listed her name in the ownership column. She drove away without looking back through the rear window. Not because it would hurt. She had done enough of that, alone, in the years when it cost something. She drove away because the road ahead was the only direction that had ever been worth her full attention. And that is the story of Abena Mensah. A girl who was handed 60 cedis and a door, who took the 60 cedis seriously, who spent 10 years becoming the person that a sealed envelope and 10 years of patience had been waiting for. Like the Sankofa bird, the one this channel is named after, she didn't look back to return to where she had been. She looked back to collect what had always been hers. And then she flew forward. That's what this story is really about. Not revenge, not triumph, just a woman who knew her own value before anyone else was willing to confirm it, and who quietly, patiently built the life that proved she was right. And I want to come back to Akua for a second, because I don't think Akua is a villain in the traditional sense. She was 16 when Abena left. She watched from the stairs and said nothing. But she was 16, in a household her mother controlled completely, and saying something would have cost her something she didn't know how to pay. Does that excuse it? No, but it explains it. What matters is what happened in that hallway with the 2 cups of tea. Because Akua could have said nothing. She could have handed Abena the tea and walked away and let the transaction complete without ever acknowledging what it meant. Instead, she said, "I watched you leave. I didn't do anything." That's not an apology, but it's something. It's the first honest thing that has ever passed between them in that house. And Abena received it exactly as it was, not more, not less. "I didn't come back, Akua. I arrived. There's a difference. Coming back is for people who left something unfinished. Arriving is for people who built something and brought it with them. Abena didn't return to that house. She came to it for the first time on her own terms, with her own resources, as the person her father always believed she would become. And now, if you want to know the real ending, Madame Efua and Akua still live in that compound. They pay rent to Abena's management company every month. Processed through the same clean, accurate systems she spent 10 years building. No drama, no confrontation. Just a standing order and a property in her name. That's justice. Not loud, not theatrical, just permanent.